Good morning, everybody. My name is Bob Yapp, and I am a secular humanist and have been all my life. I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, and when we moved there, I was born in Kirkwood, Missouri, which is a burb of St. Louis, for those that don't know. And my father, very interesting upbringing. Both my parents were from Manhattan, Kansas. And when they grew up, there really wasn't a Unitarian church in Manhattan, Kansas, which is a college town. But my mother was a multi-generational Unitarian. Her family was the Adam family. Robert Adam was the architect to the crown in England during the 1700s. And the side of my mom's family decided to come to the United States, ended up in Boston, and helped establish the first Unitarian church in America in Boston. And that was in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So, and then that passed on through for many, many years. My father was a Quaker. And so when my father got out of World War II, he came home and they told him he could get degrees in whatever he wanted. So he got degrees in entomology and chemistry. And he was just going to be a beekeeper because he thought that was the right thing to do. And it's kind of a Zen kind of a thing for my dad, who was actually a very conservative man. And then Chevron came on campus and said, no, you're the only human being in the world with these two specific degrees. And we think agriculture needs a pump to feed starving people around the world, and would you lead that effort? So my father created the ag chemical industry in America, which is very problematic in many, many ways. It didn't take him long to figure that out, and he left Chevron after he went to them and said, we can build this first chemical plant in Fort Madison, Iowa. We can build it and we can make it so it puts no pollution in the river and puts no pollution in the air, and I have designed the first environmentally sound chemical plant ever in the world. And Chevron said, if you don't build the polluting one, you're fired. And I think that it was downhill for my dad from there on, and because my father was a very principled man and felt that the environment really mattered. He was also head of the Republican Party in Iowa, which is interesting. My mother, in 1946, while he was still in college, began writing about feminism and was ostracized by all the women in Manhattan, Kansas, and she just kept on plugging away. She had met, when she was young, a fellow named William Allen White, who was a prolific writer about social justice and those kinds of things when she grew up in a smaller town in Kansas. And it really influenced her wanting to be a writer. And so when I was 2, and my little sister had just been born, my dad called Chevron and said, look, I hate Missouri, and I'm moving the headquarters for Ortho, that was the name of the company that he ran, to Des Moines, Iowa. And they're like, oh, well, okay, what's going on there? He says, well, I just hate people from Missouri. And I'm like, okay. So later on in life, I'm like, Dad, what is up with that? He said, the border wars. Those folks from Missouri wanted us to be a slave state, and we didn't want to because it was against our beliefs and it was against everything that we thought was important, and we got murdered, and they tried to wreck our elections. Sound familiar? And we tried to do all these different things, and I just don't like people from Missouri. So my father is at this moment rolling over in his grave now that I live in Hannibal, so it's all right. He'll be all right. He's a big guy. We grew up I grew up in Des Moines. I moved there when I was 2. And Des Moines was really a singular experience for me because the historic architecture was everywhere. We lived in a beautiful old arts and crafts style house, 1904, with a clay tile roof, and it's just a beautiful old house in a classic old neighborhood right off the downtown. And it was a diverse neighborhood. We had all kinds of ethnic folks and people of different religions and different beliefs, and we all worked together. My neighborhood was primarily a Jewish neighborhood, I grew up across the street from a Jewish synagogue. And, like my friend Marty Deitch's mother would be like, okay, Bobby, you're not Jewish, but your parents are Unitarians, and they believe in excellence, so you can come to Marty's bar mitzvah, So I ended up going to a lot of bar mitzvahs when I was a kid. So my mother started getting better known as time went on as a feminist writer, to the point where she was writing for the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, wrote a book about how awful it is being a corporate wife, which she was, but she never played, and almost got my dad fired over and over and over again. My dad was the first executive at Chevron to hire an African American, the first one to hire a woman into traditionally male roles, the first one to hire salespeople that were not college educated. He hired farmers because they were dealing with farmers and they were selling things to farmers. And my dad's division ended up being the top producing division for the entire company. But every time he did this, he got threatened to be fired. So at 57, he took his ball and all the documents, and he went to Greenpeace, and he went out on the road and started talking about how evil the petrochemical industry is. So I have to give my father a lot of cred for that. Interesting guy. So I would go out to the airport as a kid to pick up a speaker that my mother was bringing into town, and they would stay at our house, and I'll never forget meeting Bella Abzug at the Des Moines airport. Now, how many people have ever heard of Bella Abzug in this audience? No one? You ever heard of Gloria Steinem? Yeah. Yeah, well, she stayed at our house too. So, and I was pretty enamored because she was good looking and smart, oh my God. And then my dad would take me out to the airport, and we'd pick up Barry Goldwater to stay at our house. So dinner at my house was always fascinating. We had all kinds of wonderful discussions. We were required to read a book every week and discuss it in length at Sunday breakfast. Both of my parents were atheists, which is fascinating to a lot of people. But my mother's side of the family, through the Unitarian connection, had been atheists since the late 1700s, early 1800s. They were definitely secular humanists. They believed that human beings had control over their destiny, and that they had choices to make in life. And that it always made my mother absolutely nuts when someone would say, well, it's God's will. No, it's not God's will. That's a way to get around taking responsibility for your own life, she would say. And those kinds of messages really set forth a lot for me. So my dad was traveling all over the world when he was still with Chevron. And I would do anything to hang out with my dad when he came home. He was an old house weekend warrior and worked on our house, and he was a really good woodworker. And I'm down in the shop with him because he was home for the weekend. I think I was building some little box. And he says, we don't own this house. And I started to cry. I'm like, what do you mean? Are we moving? He says, no, do you love this house? I said, yeah. You took the drywall down off the ceiling, and there were beams, and there's all these alcoves, and it's a beautiful house. Why are we moving? He says, we're not moving. Stop crying. Go down. You can go down to the county courthouse, and they'll tell you we own this house, but don't you ever think that we own this house. It is our job to do quality work that lasts, so that the next family can enjoy this house as much as we have. And that's called stewardship, Bobby. That's what he called it. He was Bob Sr., so I was Bobby as a kid. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. I'm standing here today doing what I do every single day because of that ethic that is almost non-existent in this country today. We worry more about, I call it the McDonald's syndrome. We want it fast, we want it cheap, and we don't want to lift a finger. And life is really not like that. My friend Paul here, he is a hammer swinger extraordinaire. He's got more projects going on than I do all the time. He's my neighbor, and Alice as well. So, and Alice is a serial student at my school. has taken a lot of classes. We say that with love. So growing up, there was a small Unitarian group in Des Moines, but they hadn't built a church really yet. They were kind of hanging out in some building downtown. They ended up building a beautiful mid-century Unitarian church in the mid-60s. But by then, my mother wanted us to have the fellowship of being around other like-minded people. So we ended up going to a church called Plymouth Congregational Church until the Unitarian church was fully open. And Plymouth was really a Unitarian church. I don't care what they called themselves. We never talked about Jesus. We never talked about, when we talked about Jesus, we talked about how to be more like Jesus, not how to make more money or how to do this or that, or how to, make my life better. It's all about me, me, me. That was never part of my life, and it was never part of that life in that church. Plymouth Congregational Church is the largest church in Des Moines yet today. And it was an amazing experience through youth fellowship, and all the Unitarians in town went there as well because we didn't have a place at that time. We had choirs, and we sang we traveled all over the world. We made albums with our choirs, and it was just absolutely great. But the most important thing that we did is that we went into, usually on Sundays and Saturdays, into the low-income neighborhoods and helped people that needed help fix their houses and work on their houses. And to me, that seemed more ethical and more principled than just sitting around doing catechisms and things like that. And I'm not slamming religions. I very much understand why people have religion in their life. But I do believe in the human being. And I think that the human being is a unique mammal in that in so many ways we can, and maybe other mammals can do this, but we're not sure, that we have the ability to imagine how something could be. And that, for me, is what preservation is all about. I have almost every single property that I've restored over the years has been on a demolition list or endangered, mostly by notorious slumlords. Both of our communities have this issue, and we don't have effective rental inspection programs. So we license beauty parlors, we license restaurants, we license all these different entities for health and safety, but we don't do that for the very places where people bathe their babies and take care of their homes. I think that is not principled, and I think as communities we need to do more of that for basic health and safety so people can live, because working poor people created these communities. They did. I saw a meme today on the internet that rich people survive because there's lots of poor people, and without poor people, rich people can't survive. And I think there's some serious truth to that. I have bumped into being wealthy in my life, and I have walked away from it every single time. When I was on PBS in 1995 through 2000 approximately, we were fortunate that we had 5 million viewers a week, which is, I was told at the time, was unprecedented. That Martha Stewart and this old house had never had more than 2 million a week. And I'm like, well, how do you know that? He said, well, we do Nielsen, we do the Nielsen ratings. I'm like, at PBS? I didn't think they did Nielsen ratings, but they did. And I get a call from PBS, and this is in 2000, and they said, you need to come into DC and talk to us because you're going to be wildly wealthy. You're going to be a multimillionaire, and you need to have a financial advisor, and we want to sit down and chat with you about how that's all going to work out for you. So I flew out there, and I get into this room, and there's all the people, top people from PBS and the top people from Ace Hardware. So the show costs about $2 million a year to do, and Ace was putting up $1 million of that $2 million. So it was wonderful to have an underwriter like that. Underwriter is a fancy way of saying advertiser on PBS. And they were lauding me and the show and everybody involved, and then they said, but there's a problem. I said, okay, what's the problem? well, the problem is that you're not a team player. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? And they said, well, you're a preservation show. I said, yeah, we're sponsored by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We're trying to bring preservation to the average old house owner and show them practical ways to keep the character defining features of their house, but not live in a museum and have things that we live like, outhouses are okay, but that kind of thing. And they said, well, the guys from this old house, they take free trucks and free roofs and free geothermal from all the underwriters, and you keep refusing to take anything free from them. I said, I know, it's PBS. I'm not going to take anything free from the underwriters. And they're like, well, you're really not much of a team player. And I said, look, I have one client, and that is the consumers that live and raise their families in historic and old homes. And I want to be able to say to them, I've tested all of the tools in this genre, and this one's the best because of electrical or whatever, very definable reasons. And if I'm getting paid by a company or getting free products from them, where's my credibility? And they said, well, we sort of understand that, but you're still not a team player. And then Ace Hardware said, we've sponsored this old house, Martha Stewart. We've never seen the kind of numbers that you're pulling in. It's unbelievable, but we have a problem too. And I'm like, okay, what? Well, you're a preservation show. And I'm like, okay, here we go again. And they said, about a third of our Ace dealers sell vinyl windows and vinyl siding, and you just slam them constantly. I said, yeah, it's my job to tell people what is garbage and what is not. And both of those products are unsustainable, bad for our environment, not energy efficient as they're lied to about. And and Ace said, well, we're gonna have to bow out if you don't do that, if you don't promote both on the show. And I said, bow out. And I walked out of that office and I never looked back. And my wife went, you did what? I said, I did something that I think was principled. I'm not going to do that. So I then started to go out on the road and do workshops all over the country, teaching people how to do practical hands-on preservation. And that morphed into when Pat and I, and my mother passed away in 2007. And she left her entire estate to Planned Parenthood of America. God bless my mother, which made my brother just absolutely apoplectic. But I was very proud of her because my conservative father and my conservative mother, along with several other couples in Des Moines, founded Planned Parenthood of Iowa. They would kick my father out of the Republican Party today, no question about it, but he was more of an Eisenhower type Republican. And so the bottom line for me is that we need to, historic preservation and Unitarianism, to me, are one and the same. It's about an ethical approach to how we help other people. Now, historic preservation isn't just about the big banker's house. I mean, I own a huge lawyer's mansion who was a US congressman, but he was also a slave owner. And doing research about this guy, growing up in Iowa, you read Huck Finn, you know about Jim and that, but I didn't understand that Hannibal was almost 30% enslaved people up until 1865. I started pulling the mantles off to restore them, and in the back, a beautiful script hand carved was the name Henry, just Henry. And come to find out, Henry was one of his slaves and had a crew that Mr. Lamb would rent out to build things. So most of the architecture in Hannibal was built by enslaved peoples before 1865. I found an article in the basement of the library in Hannibal that Henry had, in 1865, within 3 months after the war ended, took his family and all of his crews and moved them to a safer community that had a reputation for being anti-slavery, and that was Des Moines, Iowa. And I'm like, that can't be, right? So I'm growing up in Des Moines. I'm around all these African-American artisan tradespeople, woodworkers, carvers, brick masons, all these fabulous small companies of African Americans doing all this work. And I thought that would be normal when I got out in the big world, and it's very unusual. And so I ended up, when I got some of this preliminary research, I'm still trying to get this all figured out. I called a friend of mine up in Des Moines that I grew up with, African American guy. His father was a furniture maker, he's a furniture maker. And I said, John, you ever heard of an enslaved man named Henry from Hannibal, Missouri? And there was this long pause. He said, you got to be kidding me. I said, why? Because I think he's my great-great-great-grandfather. And I burst into tears. Just that connection, not knowing it, and just coming to Hannibal and having that kind of connection is so valuable to me. So in our bed and breakfast, we've named the rooms after the enslaved people. We talk about them first because they built the house. And I think that that's a very, very important part of it. I've been very fortunate in my life. My mother told me 3 things when I was a little kid. And 2 of them were a lie, and 1 was true. She said, you're the most handsome boy in the world. I knew that was a lie. She said, you're the smartest boy in the world, and I knew that was a lie. And she said, if you put your mind to it, you can do anything you want in life. And that was true. And I found my passion very early. I bought my first house when I was still in high school. I was designing and building sets as a volunteer at the Des Moines Community Playhouse, which was founded by Cloris Leachman, by the way, if you remember her as an actress. She there was a gay couple, 30-ish or so, and apparently they thought it was unseemly that I was bragging about saving up $10,000 from my paper route. Well, I had the biggest paper routes in Des Moines. I mean, I was rocking it out. And I was proud of it. I saved 10 grand. And they said, well, you keep bragging about it. What we heard that San Francisco is a safer place for gay couples, so we're going to move there. And why don't you buy our house? I said, it's in 1973. I'm like in high school. I'm like, I can't buy your house. I'm in high school. Why don't you come out and look at it? So we drove up, and it was on the east side of town. There's good sides of town, and then perceptually people think other sides of town aren't that great, right? Like I live in a neighborhood right off the downtown. That's the downtown people. And I drove up, and it was right across from a park that had been dedicated by Teddy Roosevelt called Union Park after he had an epiphany that unions were a good thing. And it was an arts and crafts bungalow. I didn't know that's what it was called. It had casement window, porch, looking out over the park, a little balcony above it, stucco on the first floor, cedar shingles on the siding on the second floor. Walked inside, there was all this woodwork with this weird stripy stuff in it. I didn't know that was white quarter sawn oak, but that's what it was. Built-in china cabinets in the dining room with hardware that looked like somebody taken a hammer and beat it up with it. I was just enamored. And the brand new lime green shag carpet with the plastic rake was going to come with the house. I'm thinking, wow, man, it doesn't get any better than this in 1973, So I go upstairs, and there's a scuttle hole in the ceiling, a little access to the attic, and I said, can I get up in there? And sure. So I see a bunch of rolls of wallpaper. I said, can I bring them down? And they said, sure. So I brought them down. It wasn't wallpaper, it was the original blueprints. And as I unrolled them, the catalog fell out, and it was dog-eared on a page, and it was dog-eared on the page where they had ordered the plans to build this house, and they were signed by Gustav Stickley, who was the father of the arts and crafts movement in America. And I didn't know who Gustav Stickley was. I didn't know any, but I knew this was something special. My mom had always had an antique shop, and so I was around some of that. And I said, well, how on earth would a high school student buy this from me? Well, you have 10 grand. I'll sell it to you for 16,000. You give us 2,000 down. We'll be the bank. You don't have to go to a bank. We'll just sell it to you on contract. You get a rehab before you graduate, make some money, and be down the road. I said, far out. That is the grooviest thing I ever heard in my life, and I did it. And I bought that house, and my buddy Mark and we got bids from Pella Window to replace all the windows, and we got bids to put now you have to remember, this is 73, 74. The wider everything was, the groovier you were. Ties, lapels, leisure suits, all that stuff. So we wanted really wide aluminum siding on that thing. We got all the bids together and they were close to 30 grand. And I'm in tears. I'm like, what are we going to do? And just went over and looked at the windows. And ropes were broken. The putty was falling out. There was a little trap door, like a stash, where you could put your stash. Not that I know what a stash is back then, but and there's weights inside there. We can get rope down at the hardware store, and Dad always had that DAP, that can of DAP 33 on the counter. That must be glazing putty. And so we get some of that, and then, how are we going to fix the rot? Well, there wasn't anything like architectural epoxies back in those days, but I had this idea to go down to the auto supply store and buy Bondo. But don't ever use Bondo. Bondo bad. Bondo. I went back and replaced all that Bondo for the couple we sold the house to some years later. So we get the house all dolled up. We painted the outside, put a new roof on it. Mark and I did. We had a 6-pack of beer. Of course, we shouldn't have had a 6-pack of beer. We had pulled back the shag carpet, and back in the day, my grandma used to do this too. She would re-shellac everything. She never cleaned anything. She just shellac over all the dirt, get darker and darker and darker. And the floor was almost black, but I spilled a beer on the floor, and I got the rag and wiped it up, and all the finish came off. And I went, ooh, let's go down to the hardware store and buy some denatured alcohol. And we did, and we stripped all that woodwork and all those floors with alcohol. We did turn off the pilot lights and open some windows. And I have never put a sander on a floor since then. I've hand stripped floors all my life. We use on really rough floors, we use a less aggressive type sander sometimes. It's called a U sander. But the bottom line is that I didn't know what I was doing was preservation, but it was the purest form of preservation. It's preserving and taking care of what we have, and not doing things to it that will mess it up, and covering up the architecturally significant features of the house. So I called a realtor, and I said, do you think you could sell this house over in Union Park for $35,000 or so? Thinking, okay, 16 and 10, 20, we'd make a few $1,000, right? She comes out and she says, nope, we're going to list it for 82. It sold the first day for 84. And I was just like, wow, I think I found my love. It really wasn't about the money as much. I mean, the money was pretty cool to a 17-year-old kid. But I just thought, this house was really in bad shape, and we fixed it. Kind of a resurrection in a sense. And what could be more cool than going into dilapidated neighborhoods and finding the worst houses and showing people the possibilities? In order to do that, you have to have some skills. And I learned quite a few skills on my own on that first house. So we go to the bank to close. The closing lady's getting everybody's IDs, and she's like, you're not even 18, you can't cite a deed. And I'm like, really? Oh, you can make an exception. She's like, no, we can't. You have to go get your parents. So I left, and I looked at Mark, and I went, because we never told my parents that we were doing it. And I had to go home. My dad was back in town. My dad was 6'10". So it was like, Dad, I bought this house over on the east side. And I started, he said, you did what? You little liar. You told your mother you were going to the library to study and going out on dates, and you're over on the east side working on some crappy old house over. He was mad. Steam coming out of his ears. And then I said, and Dad, we put 26,000 into it, and I sold it for 84,000. And there was this silence, and he came over, and he looked down at me, and he put his arm around me and said, what a fine capitalist boy you are. I starved half to death the first half of my career because I stuck with what I loved. And when things were tight, I kept going at it. When I was supposed to show up at the University of Iowa, I had a full ride scholarship, academic scholarship at the University of Iowa. I didn't show up. because I had a chance to do an apprenticeship as a furniture designer and maker with an internationally known German furniture maker who had married a woman in Des Moines and had a shop in Hamburg, Germany, one in Rhode Island, because he taught at the Rhode Island School of Design. And I had to beg my way. It took me almost a month of going over to his shop door every day and knocking on the door. And he's like, "Get away, kid. I'm not hiring any apprentices. I'm 73 years old and done." And I kept coming back, and he said, "What will it take to get you to leave me alone?" I said, "Well, if I bring you a piece I made, a piece of a coffee table I made, and you look at it, if you like it, will you hire me?" He says, "I'm not going to like it. Bring it over. I guarantee you it's a piece of garbage. You can go ahead and bring it over." He did this in a German accent. I can't even reproduce that. Not even try. So I brought it over. He opened the door enough for me to hand it into him, and he slid it into the shop. And about 20 minutes later, the shop door opened up and said, "You're hired. $2.10 an hour." And I'm like, "Wow, big money too, you know." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because this is an amazing piece. It's sitting in my front parlor. It's the only piece of all the furniture I've designed and built that I've kept, that I did for myself, that I've kept over the years. And it's a hand-carved hairy lion's paw foot, acanthus leaves, and I was really, it was a fun piece, and it got me my apprenticeship. And I learned a lot of that, but there weren't people to teach us how to do old houses back in those days. In the mid and late 70s, it was tough. When I got done with the apprenticeship, I opened a furniture making shop in downtown Des Moines. And then in Iowa City, I went to school and I studied philosophy, religious philosophy specifically, being raised an atheist, secular humanist, Unitarian. That's what you're going to do. Rehabbing houses, helping people in the neighborhoods. So I want to end this to tell you a little bit about one of the most important things that I've ever had the chance to be involved in my life. And that was in Hannibal, Missouri. When I got to Hannibal, I saw all these 14 and 15-year-old kids roaming the streets during school. Now, you will see this in about every town. Kids drop out, and they're getting rascally, getting in trouble. So I went out, but I saw an awful lot for the size of Hannibal. So I went out to the superintendent, and I said, "Jill, what's up with these kids?" She said, "They come from the worst families. They've been raped and beaten, horrible things that I can't even describe. They're in the juvenile justice system. They can't get out. It's a one-way street to death or imprisonment for a lot of these kids, and there's nothing we can do." And I said, "Well, that's a bunch of baloney. We're going to start a program. You're going to hire my school. We're going to start the Historic Preservation Trades program in Hannibal, Missouri. We're going to take these kids and we're going to have them come in the morning and learn historic preservation trades, half girls, half boys." I insisted on. And we ran that program for 6 years. New superintendent and new principal decided it wasn't a good thing to have this old hippie guy running a program off campus, so they canceled it, which was really a mistake because all the kids dropped out immediately. So anyway, in 6 years, we graduated 160 kids that would have never graduated from high school, usually the first in their families. And Pat and I sort of became their parents. My friend John Bales, raise your hand, John, please. John is a dear friend of mine. He's a preservation carpenter, and he moved to town, to Hannibal, and moved his family there. And John would fill in when I was on the road doing workshops or that kind of thing. John would fill in for me and teach those kids. But I have to tell you, the one thing that I learned from those kids is that they were the finest human beings I've ever known in my life. They were good kids. Not every one of them, but the majority of them went on to have, some of them didn't go into the trade, some of them did, but many of them have had really good lives because they had a chance for the first time to see something functional in their life around them every day, be told when they were doing something well, and then instead of berating them when something went wrong, talking about, okay, we have a situation, let's find out what the solution is. I mean, it's a different approach. And those kids come back. John and I just see them constantly. They just come back all the time to see Pat and Bob. Love it when John's around. And I feel very honored to have been a part of that. I've taken that model now and I'm setting them up all over the country. So I just got done setting up a historic preservation trade school in Cincinnati, Ohio, the greater Cincinnati area. And we did some studies and found that there were all of these Latina and all of these African-American single moms that would love to get into the trades, but this, the daycare, and transportation, and all the issues, and no one had ever identified them until we did this study in any city as a group of people that could come into the trades where we need people in that preservation trades. So we set it up so that we have transportation, we have interpreters, we have daycare set up for these students, and then we went to the contractors in town and we said, will you hire these students at your base rate and work them for 3 weeks every month, and then let them come and take their whatever, if they want to go into masonry or carpentry or whatever, for 1 week each month, and pay them and pay their tuition while they do it. And I thought they were going to tell us, get out of here. And they all went, absolutely, let's start tomorrow. They just all jumped on board. So there's just a lot of people, good people out there that could be served well. Some pointy-headed folks in the late 1960s at a university, and I shouldn't say that too loudly because my wife was in a social policy think tank at the University of Chicago for many years on children's issues. And many things that come out of those think tanks are good. But the idea that everyone had to go to college was absurd at best. Not everyone should go to college. The trades are a fine way to make a living, and the preservation artisan trades takes it up even a notch higher. You want to be laid off all your life, go into new construction. You want to be working and 2 years booked out the rest of your life, you go into historic preservation, because that's where the real jobs are. And we need to save what we have left. I'll never forget when the Mayor Hark in Hannibal, were presenting a new preservation ordinance and design guidelines, screamed at me, why do you outsiders want to change Hannibal? And I said, Your Honor, none of us in this room want to change Hannibal. We love Hannibal. We want to save what's left. That's all we want to do. And he was very irate. But it also gave me a tone of what I was dealing with. So I've learned to come in through the back door in Hannibal and work with people and sometimes make them feel that it's their idea and get them involved, because if you don't, you're in trouble with a town that has been around as long as Hannibal. One final note before I go, I know I'm over. Hannibal, the Scottish Kentuckians that founded Hannibal couldn't figure out a way to build a proper brick kiln. And the Hannibal clay was so bad, they didn't realize it. Just downriver in Louisiana, Missouri, the clay was excellent. They didn't know that. So they would build brick structures and the brick would start to melt away on the workers' houses that were being built. So a bunch of people, including Mr. Lamb, came over to Quincy to see if they could buy some of that fabulous German brick, right? They got chased out of town at gunpoint and told that we don't sell our bricks to slave owners. And on that note, I think things have changed, obviously, but I think Quincy and Hannibal are two of the most amazing jewels in the entire country. When I try to explain to people Vermont and Main Street around the country, they're like, well, that's not possible. It's not possible that there's that much still there, but it is still there. It's wonderful. So in the final analysis for me, being a lifelong Unitarian, generational Unitarian, has everything to do with historic preservation and the ethic of taking care of what we have. We have to build new. I understand innovation, but we need to take care of what we have, and that's what preservation is. Thank you.